Okay, so welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have here Alessandra Sciutti. Alessandra is a tenure track researcher at the IIT, and she's head of the Cognitive Architecture for Collaborative Technologies, the Contact Unit. Before she has been postdoc at the IIT, and then she spent some time in the USA and in Japan, if I remember. And in 2018, she has been awarded of the RC Starting Grant Whisper, focused on the investigation of joint perception between humans and robots. And I think she's going to say something about the project in her seminar. So please, Alessandra.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, for having me. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure being here to narrate a bit about the research we are conducting at IIT that actually belong both to the unit and the Whisper project, and which is the ERC project that Nicoletta was mentioning before. But before entering in the research, I would like to state which is the problem we are facing with our research. Indeed, what we have seen in the past few years has been an incredible advance in terms of intelligence, so our artificial intelligence capabilities. Now we have computers that beat us in almost any strategic game we can think of. And we can see robots that are much, much better than us at performing movements. So this makes the most astonishing the fact that when it comes to basic social skills, the very same artificial intelligence, the very same robots fail. So how is it possible that a machine that can do a backflip with no issue doesn't understand that this person has an intention to shake the hand? Well, this aligns a bit with what has been called the Moravec's paradox, that we can summarize by saying that what we believe are hard problems are actually easy problems, and the opposite. So what it is easy for a 4-year-old child, it's super difficult to be implemented in a machine. Whereas maybe very complex skills to our eyes, like engineering or strategy or computational tasks, well, they are much easier to be tackled by artificial intelligence. But whereas the Moravec's paradox in its original formulation was mostly referring to mobility, you have seen that mobility is improving. I mean, robots are moving very nicely. The next barrier is actually the social one. Indeed, we are still encountering difficulties in having robots that are as nice, as socially intelligent as our neighbor. And this is annoying in some sense, because we have come to believe that this is quite easy, because it's quite easy for us. We develop social skills since the very beginning of our life, during childhood. So for us, it really becomes natural to interact with others. How come robots can't do the same? Well, the reason, it's us. The reason, the fault, it's on humans' shoulder. It's us. We are so terribly complicated. And it's so difficult, therefore, for a machine to be able to understand us. Let me give you a practical task. So if I show this figure, as I usually do, and I ask you to think of what is the difference between these two images, what do you think it is? I'll wait a few seconds for the virtual thinking. And then I'll tell you that the most times I ask this at conference or events, even in real life events, most people told me, well, it's a different in the lighting. So one it's lit in a different way than the other, which is true, by the way. But the real difference is that one is convex and the other is concave. But we don't see it as concave. We don't, because our perception is much more than just processing the input stimuli that are in front of our eyes. It's much more than just reading the word in front of us. Our brain, indeed, all the time, performs perception as an inference. It takes the visual input, yes, but then it enriches it. It uses prior knowledge, prior experience. In this case, which is called the hollow face illusion, for instance, you use the fact that most of the times the faces you have seen in your life were convex. And so what you perceive is a convex face. And this is a very, very basic mechanism in our brain. Our brain tries to optimize perception, filling the gaps by introducing more information than what is present in the scene. And we know it from the wide range of visual illusions that we have come to know and love, some of us at least, during our life. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't apply just to the perception of the world. It applies to the perception of others. Our perception is really distorted. We are not aware, but these priors become actually biases. We have bias that modify our perception of others and the world continuously. And why is it so, you might ask? I mean, why do we make always these errors? Because we are not perceiving accurately. Well, because it serves a purpose. Apparently, or it seems, that a lot of these priors, a lot of these biases are actually in place because they make our perception better, more appropriate, for instance, more effective for social interaction. So it allows us to, deal when the information is too much, and so we simplify. Or when we have to remember too many things, and so we cut off something. Or when we have to act rapidly, very fast. Well, then it's okay to be not accurate, but be fast enough to deal with interaction. And this applies in a wide range. We can generally say that the internal models that we build by acting in the world are then shaping not only the way we act, but they interfere, they modify our perception of the world and of other sections. We can summarize this by saying, well, we don't see the world or the other people for what they are, for what it is, but we see it deformed, modified through an anthropomorphic lens. So our own experiences, our own motor actions have built this kind of lens that modifies the input and allows to interact more easily. I would say that the most paradigmatic example of that comes from neuroscience. It's been quite a while now, but that there has been the discovery of the mirror neurons. So by the group of Birzolatti in Parma, they found out that indeed the very same areas in our brain that are responsible to control our movement, well, they are activated. They respond also when we are looking at someone else performing the same action. And this really means that we're using a sort of vocabulary that has been built through our own acting in the world to interpret, understand, even predict the actions of others. And this, of course, creates a wonderful sort of matching between me and the others, facilitating the understanding. And this deformation, this anthropomorphic lens, is what transforms actions in forms of communication. So if I show you this video, you can see that there is a guy, and of course his intention is to pass you an apple. I show this, hoping the zoom allows to perceive it. Well, it's the same guy. You don't even see its face. But I bet you wouldn't like his apple. You realize that there is something different between the two. Something strange. So even this basic passing action acquires a totally different meaning just because the style of the action has changed. So in one case, it's a nice and gentle passing. In the other case, I guess the guy is really upset with me for some reason. And the interesting point is that our brain is actually designed to read this form of communication. So it is recent results that show that there is a specific part of our brain, the dorsocentral part of the insula, which is actually sensitive to this little variation in the way I move. And it's able to understand whether I'm, for instance, gentle or kind, or I'm aggressive. So this little variation, well, it's just one of the many examples of communication, of signals that we pass and we receive when we are acting. So whenever I move, even if I don't want to, I'm sending you a lot of different information. And you, by watching me, by listening to me, well, even without awareness, you're processing them. You're noticing from my head movement, my arm movement, my eyes, the prosody, even how close I get. Well, you're perceiving something about me, my internal state, and even more than I would like to actually reveal to you. And you're doing that without awareness and without cognitive load. I mean, the brain is able to actually handle this very rich flow of information and use it continuously without you needing to focus or voluntarily attend to this information. And this is what makes human-human collaboration, human-human interaction so effortless sometimes and so effective, because we continuously can anticipate the need of our partner, predict what he's gonna do, just by processing this signal over time. Well, robots are not yet as good. They can't do that at the moment. On the other hand, they could be useful because they can play a different role in the context of cognitive interaction. They can become the tool to investigate these mechanisms. On the one hand, they can become models where we can implement our approaches, our tentative copy of this mechanism, and test them on an embodied platform during an actual interaction with people. And on the other hand, we can use them as stimuli. You have, again, an agent, and you can manipulate with total controllability and repeatability its way of behaving, its way of perceiving during an interaction. And this is a unique tool to study how an interaction dynamically evolves without losing controllability. If you think of the diagram that I showed you before, we as humans continuously use all these signals together, or most of them. We cannot really separate. Some of them are not even controllable by the best actors. Well, a robot overcomes this issue because we definitely can separate its facial expression from its kinematics, or the way it moves its eyes and the way it moves its arms, disgregating, for instance, visual-motor coordination, which is something that is very, very difficult to break in humans, even by human actors. So a robot, and in particular a humanoid robot, as the iCub we are mostly using in our research, is actually a very precious platform because it allows us to study which of these human models can be ported, can be effectively transferred to a robot, so as for it to become an agent during an interaction. So this is the kind of research that we have been carrying on since quite some time now. And it's a long story yet, because it is very difficult to try and put the robot to use effectively these very same signals that we were discussing before. So what we want, ideally, is to try and have the robot become able both to send those signals, so to transform its own actions into formal communications, and to read those signals. So to be able, in other words, to see the world as we humans do, to share their perception with us. And today I want to give you a sort of brief overview of a few of the studies that we have conducted in this line of research. And I would like to start with this idea of the robot as communicator, because it's a little easier, just a little though. And the idea here, I remind you, is let's transform robot actions into a form of communication, as humans are. So one of the first studies that we did in this context was to try and see whether we can evoke the same collaboration mechanisms that are common to human-human interaction. One of this is automatic imitation of speed. Classic example, I walk along the road, you're walking with me, I become a little faster for no reasons, you become faster for no reasons again. You're imitating me without awareness. That's supernatural, super useful in collaboration. And our question was, well, does it apply also to human-robot collaboration? And the answer originally was yes. So if you look in the graph, you see that when the robot, the stimulus, changes its velocity, also the participants change its velocity with no request, with no noticing even it. So very good. The automatic imitation occurs also for human-robot interaction, but not always. So as soon as the robot stopped moving with a biologically inspired velocity profile, so acceleration, deceleration, and started moving with a basic constant velocity, the automatic imitation disappeared. So this means that we are not imitating something automatically just because it looks like a human, but the kinematic features of the way it moves are crucial in activating these basic coordination mechanisms that are supported, for instance, by the mirror neurons. We also experimented a bit, checking whether the shape of the trajectory mattered. So does it matter if it's a nice and smooth trajectory versus, a square trajectory, the one we traditionally associate in our mind to robots? No, that doesn't matter. As far as the biological properties are preserved in terms of the velocity profile, then the shape doesn't matter at all. And more recently, we tried out whether it was possible to have the same mechanism in a slightly more ecological scenario. Let's call it a cooperation. It's not really a collaboration, but let's say during concurrent actions. And the answer is indeed yes. We noticed that, again, even in this task, the faster the robot got, the faster participant got, even though this was not caused by the experimental design per se. And interestingly, this phenomenon was constant, was stable across different cultures, because we tested it both in Italy and in Japan, and we found out the very same result. Coming back again to this idea of the style of the action, we asked ourselves, well, but is it possible for a robot also to exhibit, communicate through its motion style? And the question was, what do we need to put onto the robot motion so as for it to appear rude or gentle as a human performing the same action? And we tried retargeting the motion of the human on the robot, and we verified that indeed, while asking people to judge the human and the robot motion, they recognize them either as rude or gentle in a similar manner between the two actors. And more interestingly, these are very recent results we just published on scientific Rapport. Also, the neural response was non-significantly different between the robot observation and the human observation, as you can see on the bottom graph. So the insula, those little part of the brain that is responsible to process the style of the action, well, was activated in the same way, as far as the robot moved right. Again, that was not obvious though, because our first attempt was, okay, when you move rudely, you are fast. When you move gently, you are slow. We applied this modification in the movement of the robot, And the result didn't work. So although people still judged aggressive, rude, when it was a matter of just openly judging the movement, when we went to see the neural response, we found very significant difference between the observation of the human and the robot. Whereas when we retargeted the entire movement and the entire kinematics properties to the robot, then we managed to achieve the correct communication of style. This reveals us that it's not enough to have biological motion, as we discussed in the first experiment. We need fine-tuning of also subtle features that could be, for instance, the acceleration pattern to make the action communicate what it would naturally communicate in a human. And the very interesting thing is that it doesn't affect only neural response. It has practical consequences also in the human-robot interaction. So what happens if I'm receiving an object? I have to take an object from a robot, and the robot is passing me the object with a rude or a gentle style. Well, this changes the way I take the object. So it changes, if you're passing me the object in a rude way, I will move more rudely. And if you pass it to me in a gentle way, I will move in a gentler way too. And this tells us one thing. We are not even seeing the face of the robot now. It tells us that minor modification of the way the robot moves, just little changes, can affect the way the entire interaction will unfold, because it will transform also the style of my responses. And more recently, within the frame of the WISPER ERC project, we have also investigated another question. Does the way the robot behave, either human-like or mechanical-like, can affect the way I perceive its actions? And we run an experiment that is very basic in terms of psychophysics in the study of space perception, and that is usually done in isolation. So you're in front of a screen, you see two dots coming out, and then you have to reproduce the distance between the two dots. An interesting phenomenon that occurs is that when I ask you to reproduce all the different distances, you never do an accurate reproduction. So you never reproduce the lengths as they are, but you do this. You see, it's slightly flatter. This is a phenomenon which is called regression to the mean. It implies that you are basing your reproduction not only on the length that I'm showing you now, but also on the history of the lengths that I've shown you so far. So you're not trusting what you're seeing in this moment, you're using your priors. Simply the priors that you built in the previous trial. And that reflects optimization mechanism. It reflects Bayesian optimization, if you want. And it is very common and very well demonstrated in any magnitude perception. Space perception, angle perception, time perception. What we asked ourselves is, what happens if instead of being in isolation, I start working with someone else? So in this case, we had the robot showing 2 points on the screen, and the participants had to reproduce the length that the robot was showing. So we did it in 2 conditions. In one condition, the robot was acting as you see now. So he was social in some sense. So looked at the screen, looked at the person. It was human-like. In another condition, it was mechanical-like. So as you see here, it was just practically a mechanical arm. The head was fixed. There was never eye contact. There was no visual motor coordination in its movement. And we presented it as a mechanical object versus as a social object. And as you can see, this manipulation was effective. You see the judgment on the right, those bars show us that participants who played with both recognized the significant difference between a mechanical and a social rule. What we found interesting was that the reproduction of the very same stimuli, of the very same length, changed. When they were with the mechanical robot, they did what I described before in the individual setting. So they judged the length not only based on what they were seeing, but also on the history, showing a strong regression to the mean. When they were with the social robot, instead, they stopped caring about the past. They were really focusing on the here and the now, on what the robot was showing that time. And their regression to the mean not disappeared, but diminished, was significantly reduced, as you see here. This means that they were abandoning their own prior to focus more on what they were seeing in that moment. And this phenomenon was the stronger, the more they judged the robot to have become more anthropomorphic. And this tells that when you're interacting with another agent, not only you like it, you don't like it, you enjoy its company or not, but it really changed the optimization mechanisms that your brain uses to perceive the world. And this is something strong, something new that before was never found. So the fact that the very basics of our perception mechanism change just because we are involved in an interaction with another agent. And now we are investigating further the implication of this finding. So for instance, we are trying to study whether this might have an impact also in training context. So in this example, for instance, there is the participant that has to learn a very complex inverted pendulum task. Balancing it, it's quite difficult. And it has, the participants receive assistance from a hidden robot, a manipulandum. But in one condition, we fake as if it is the iCub robot providing the assistance. Very same physical assistance, just the difference in that in one case is just provided by this manipulandum. In the other case, it's provided by the manipulandum, but they believe it is the iCub robot providing. And again, here we find a significant change in the engagement that participants have in the task and the tendency to process slightly differently the training signal and being a little more able to generalize to, when the assistance is removed. So these are just a few examples of how you can use a robot as a stimulus to investigate action as a form of communication. But there are many other situations in which we use that. For instance, we infer the goal of other actions just by looking at them, and it applies to robot. We can infer the force, the effort needed to perform a certain action, and we do that all the time when we see people lifting objects. We can even be affected in our commitment to a task just by seeing a robot participating in the task with different kinematic, with different way of moving. But of course, it's not enough to have a robot be able to communicate. Communication is not unidirectional. We need it to be able to read us, our action when we're moving. And that's quite more difficult. And that's the reason why when we tackled this issue, we started from what we thought was a simpler problem. So let's start not from humans, let's start from newborns. Newborns are able from the very first hours of life to recognize whether what is moving in front of their eyes is a living being, a biological motion, or not. And of course, this is a super pro-social ability. It's a sort of very basic building block. You know that you might collaborate with what moves biologically versus with something mechanical you don't care of. So we wanted to understand how can we port this ability to our robot. And discussing with some of you who are listening, the idea that came out together was, well, what distinguishes something that moves biologically from what that moves mechanically? Well, let's look at the regularities of biological motion. One of them is the 2/3 power law. So whenever we move, in particular, it's typical of a handwriting, we don't choose our velocity randomly, but given a curved trajectory, velocity and curvature are connected by this law, which, as you can see in this nice animation, means that you slow down when you have higher curvature, and you get faster when you have lower curvature. And this was our inspiration. And so we wanted to say, what if we draw inspiration from this and we make the robot try to infer from its own eyes whether something is biological or not, as a baby. Also because babies can't have so many a priori knowledge about what's in front of their eyes. So this was the idea. We presented video sequences. Actually, the robot, through its cameras, extracted video sequences from actions performed in front of its eyes. It just extracted optical flow, so a very low-level analysis in which what it was processing was just the apparent motion. And from that, we extracted very simple geometrical properties inspired by the 2/3 power law. So velocity, curvature, radius of curvature, angular velocity. Then, proposing a training, a very short, very first training in which Alessia, you see here, is performing like mixing action, transporting action, writing, pointing, or non-biological motions like a balloon moving around, a toy train, wheels. And by giving this with as labeled training, what we found out is that the system was quite good at recognizing Nicoletta moving around, I recognize your hands, and or objects that were non-biological. And that has a nice implication, because even though it is inspired by the youngest of humans, it actually proposes a novel solution to problems that are common in activity detection in humans. Usually when you need to find an agent in the room, you resort to detecting, for instance, the color of the skin, or maybe reconstructing the skeleton. Well, here it's not necessary, because you have no assumption a priori on the fact that it is a human there. Just the signature of the motion allows you to reveal that. And that brings in a very nice outcome. The fact that you can detect the presence of humans even when no humans are in sight. So in this case, for instance, Alessia was mixing with this very long stick in front of the robot. But as you can see in the iCub view, the robot was not able to see Alessia, but it could see that there was something moving, the stick in this case, with biological motion, because it was Alessia moving it. And so by recognizing that there was a biological motion and a non-biological one, it was able to reorient its attention toward the biological motion. So this allows us, the robot indeed, to recognize and reorient its attention where a biological, so potential partner in the interaction is. And the nice aspect of this very simple low-level representation is that it really qualifies as a building block for more complex and more advanced abilities. And we started exploring some of them. So, for instance, we explored the possibility to use this description just based on a simple dynamic instant extracted from the velocity profile extracted from the optical flow. For instance, to identify regularities across different views of the same action, or to identify important moments that could be useful to synchronize the action of the robot with the action of the partner without having to know a priori the exact task, the exact detail of the physiology of movement, or the exact skeleton of the person. And more recently, we have investigated whether this representation could allow us also to describe actions in terms of movement primitives, and to use this description to verify as a way to quantify or test action similarities. And we recently found out that indeed a model that uses this approach to detect action similarities can have some traits similar to how humans detect action similarities when they are presented with impoverished stimuli. So not video of the action, but maybe point-like displays. Another rich source of information, of course, it's the face. So far I spoke about motion, but body motion, but of course also the face provides a lot of interesting insights. And we have experimented quite a little to how better describe or understand from the eyes of the robot the expression. So we Anna developed methods to extract the action units and leverage on that to gather, let's say, affective feedback from to understand what was the reaction of participants to the robot action. At the same time, Pablo decided to opt for a different method and a different description with his face channel approach. So a neural network that provides us information in terms of valence and arousal. And we recently tested that in the experiment about the inverted pendulum that I was describing before. And it really seems that it can provide some insights about how difficult participants are feeling the task without having to ask them, just by monitoring their facial expression. And speaking of face, one of the signals that are most informative at all is eyes. Often we say that eyes are mirror of the soul, and even if this is made to not be true, they certainly reveal a lot about what we want, what we aim, what we desire. And developing in the past, we have developed a system of, let's say, eye tracking that was based on the camera of the robot, and it was able to detect the direction of the eye gaze by combining the head information and the eyes information. And the beauty of the results of this system, when put at work in an interaction, is that it made the interaction flow naturally. So in the example that you're seeing, there is one participant that needs to ask for the blocks that the robot has in its hands. And we didn't provide any instruction to the participant on how to ask the blocks, either to the robot or to the confederate, the other experimenter. And as you see, the person is talking, is pointing, is smiling, a lot of signals. Well, the robot in this moment is only able to process the direction of the eye gaze. So this is only what it is using to decide what objects to pass and at what time. And the interesting result is that with no instructions to the participant and with only this signal, the robot was able to pass the right object at the right time most of the times. This tells us how rich is this information, because just with that signal alone, the robot was very effective. And the participant need not to learn anything new, not even change his natural behavior, because this gaze movement was naturally embedded in the way we interact. And we found out there that eye gaze is actually better than head gaze. Usually in robotics, you use the direction of the head as a nice way to understand where the person is looking at, but that's not as awesome, let's say. So as far as it is the time to understand whether it's robot turn or Francesco's turn to pass the object, then it works. But if the robot has to understand, for instance, which hand to use, it's not working anymore. More recently, we went further. So can the eye reveal not only what I want you to understand, but also something hidden, like, for instance, whether I'm lying or not. And to do that, we didn't use the eye tracking from camera because it was not sensitive enough. We used an eye tracker worn by the participant. And what we found out was that indeed, yes, actually it is possible. So we faced participants with two different tasks, one very long interrogation style task in which they saw robberies and then they had to lie or tell the truth, either to a robot or to a human. And we assessed that by monitoring their pupil dilation and the eloquence, we were actually able to recognize when the person was telling the truth or saying a lie with 73% accuracy. And more recently, we found out that the same holds even in much more funny or more, let's say, ecological and game-like interaction. So we designed a card game in which the participant has to lie about one of the cards, and it lasts a few minutes. And we noticed that just by monitoring pupil dilation, this time not even the eloquence, the robot is able autonomously to detect which among the 6 cards the game entails the person is lying about. And more recently, we are using also reading something else, again from the motion this time, and it's about the carefulness. So when we're moving an object, we are changing the way we move it, not only as a function of its own physical properties, but also as a function of how much care we need to use it and to move it without breaking it. And what we found out was indeed that it is possible just by monitoring the movement and without looking at the object, without knowing anything about it, it is possible to detect whether the object needs to be treated carefully or not. And that's super interesting in the context of human-robot interaction, because we might have to instruct somehow the robot to be able to treat with higher care fragile objects than others. And with this approach, it is possible to do that without having the robot to recognize the nature of the object, but just by paying attention to how the passer is moving. And all these examples were done on vision alone, but of course our form of communication is multimodal. We use all our senses indeed. And it's true that in the meanwhile, we are experimenting with other senses. So for instance, the relationship that exists by vision and touch with ad hoc devices that we are developing here, or the relationship between audio and visual information. For instance, to enable the robot to know and to learn word-object mapping just by integrating auditory attention, visual attention, and mapping the words instructed by the participant. And these are just examples. There are other research that are ongoing where we are hoping that the robot will become better and better at understanding intentions, understanding the internal state of the other, and then using also this information to become able to perform similar action as the one that we are doing. And just as a little advertisement note, if you want to have a dip into how important human motion is in terms of implication for computer vision and machine learning in general, implications for robotics, and also which are the basics that we see in humans in terms of modeling human motion, I warmly suggest this book that recently came out and that we edited with Nicoletta and with Francesco, and we have awesome authors there. So I really suggest to have a look there. What you can observe after all this charade of examples is that, well, what you have showed us so far, it's not really interaction. These are tiny examples of an interface between you and the robot. So one signal at a time, 2 signals, no more. But you showed us that we are using all the signals together, that we collaborate for longer time, that we co-adapt. Well, this is not there. And that's true, it wasn't there. This kind of research I showed you so far, it's really aimed at understanding the building blocks. So how do we use the signals? Which kind of information they carry? How they matter for us to understand the other? But that's not enough. So that's a starting point. And in the meanwhile, we're trying to address also this longer term objective, which is really that of understanding how interaction, if you want, building a rapport, a relation works. And to do that, there are two different ways that we are pursuing. One that is the longest term, if you want, crucial, is that of having an architectural view. So try to understand how the different components, so perception, action, but also memory, prediction, how they are integrated in a unitary system that makes sense of what we perceive, but at the same time is able to guide our behavior, guide our exploration, guide our prediction of what is going to happen. And this is a long travel. There are a lot of discussions ongoing. We have some first experimental testing of certain example of architecture, for instance. Anna proposed one in which he used this perception, the tactile and the affective perception I discussed before, as input in an architecture that guided the robot to select its own action based on an internal motivation. So an internal motivation aimed at maximize its internal comfort and the comfort of the partner. And this is one of the first attempts of trying to integrate both external input, but also a prediction and internal motivation mechanism within a realistic interaction. The other approach, which is more experimental, is that of trying to address or run experiments that are not targeting single signals one by one, but rather try to capture more complex constructs. This means creating experiments that are more exploratory in nature, less precise in psychophysical terms, but can allow more complex kind of interaction to emerge between the robot and the human. As an example, I usually give this of our study on trust. So the question was, can a brief interaction with the robot, the iCub, change the level of trust that a person has toward the robot? And to try and run this test, Alex designed a treasure hunt game. Hidden objects within the room, people entered, were alone with the robot, and they could ask for hints, for help if they wanted, to the robot by touching its chest. And what we saw, or what we wanted to see, is whether they relied on the iCub suggestion and whether they relied on its help. And the other question was, well, if they build trust, can this trust become over-trust? So if in the end, the robot proposes you to gamble, so proposes you, okay, you won now, but I suggest you to try and find a new hidden object that I hid. And if you find it, you double your winning. If you lose it, you lose everything if you don't. I suggest you to go and find it. And we wanted to see whether they followed its advice or not. What we found out was that during the game, already it was 30 minutes, no longer. And during the game already we observed people changing their attitude. So they asked more and more help to the robot. They relied more on its suggestion. At the very beginning, there was a chit chat. After that chit chat, they were already closer to the robot, so changed their proxemics. So short-term interaction was already enough to change your attitude. And when we went to measure the persuasion, if you want, we found out that among those who actually won the game, 100% decided to gamble the money. And some of them won, and some of them lost it. And we also asked whether the iCub suggestion was influencing them, and some of them overtly, the majority overtly said yes, that it was because of iCub that they picked that decision. But the interesting thing that we found out that was unexpected was that when we looked at how their attitudes changed toward the robot through questionnaires, which is the standard methods that are used to analyze this phenomenon, we found out that on average, all people changed their rapport to the robot. They increased their rapport with the robot. But the ones who increased their rapport to the robot the most were the ones who accepted to gamble and lost everything. So that was particularly unexpected for us. We expected that, I mean, if the robot helps you, if you trust it, and everything goes well, you will be super happy with the robot, you'll bond with it much more. And this is not the case. I mean, this is what we did not find experimentally. And this suggests that even if this experiment is exploratory, even if it is done in a lab, so it's not fully ecological, and it oversimplifies in some sense the concept of trust, it already reveals us that this concept, this construct, these social mechanisms are much more complex than what we would expect normally. So to conclude, what I showed you today is that the path towards social intelligence is still a bit long in some sense, but there are a few elements that are crucial, like that of establishing a shared perception, the importance of embodiment, the importance of a cognitive architecture. There are other points, but I was already long this slide, so I will just skip them for the moment. And really, I'm afraid that if we don't take into account that, so if we don't take into account real social intelligence, the risk is that those platforms will never become, you know, the robot assistant that we've always dreamt of. They will be left behind. And whereas what we have to aim for is to create more humane robots, so robots that are considerate of the humans, that do not need manuals or instructions to be used, because they don't need to be used. They need to interact, become co-agent with us. With that said, I want to thank all the people who actually worked and brought forward the results that I presented you today, and you for your attention. Thanks.
Thanks, Ale. Okay, so it's time for questions. So, any question?
Thank you, Alessandra. As always, very, very interesting and inspiring. There are many curiosities that I have, but I think that there is one that came with me since the beginning of your presentation, which is about, I don't know how to express precisely what I have in mind, but let's put it like this very simplified form. In the interaction, timing is important. And we've been also discussing this sometime in our collaboration. And I was wondering, in all the projects that have been carrying out, where is the time to start considering the time and the speed and the right time to engage some form of interaction in one or another direction? So you've been discussing many examples. At what speed, so to speak, do you put them together?
So one big point, it's really understanding the timing of when to start the interaction. So that's actually one of the largest challenges that are faced with all the robots that are, and also the artificial intelligence in general that are meant to be deployed with humans. So for instance, we're very annoyed when the timing is wrong, when we are interrupted, when they should not interrupt us. So and this is something that, however, we tend to communicate very well. So for a human, it's much easier to understand whether it is not the case or the case to, it's the time or not the time to interact, or we have tried, for instance, experimentally to investigate that in terms of understanding from the gaze, whether it is possible to infer whether a person is ready to interact or not. And in a simple task, again, simplified scenario, in a dictation scenario, we found out that looking at the gaze, it's already quite good to establish a basic turn taking. So again, participants were not instructed what to do, and they learned very autonomously to look at the robot when they were ready to do the next thing. So in that case, it was not even prediction. It was just sensing when the person was ready. But more in general, trying to understand the issue of time is on different layers, if you want. There is the time when we started the interaction. There is this entire issue of establishing a shared perception of time, because as in the example that I showed, that each of us has its own perception of space due to priors, the same applies to time. So a big question still open is, well, but if I have to coordinate with you, somehow we need to have established a commonalities in time perception. And how to do that, it's not obvious. We are investigating that. And I've recently just seen at the ICDL EPIROB conference a very nice paper discussing on how to make machines have an internal model of time that somehow resembles or captures some of the regularities that biological agent time perception has. So it's really a hot question in the field.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 So, I mean, it's an ambitious project with a clear long-term goal and several steps along the way. I'm thinking a bit in terms of much more humble objectives, and a bit perhaps more on the technical side, meaning, for example, here machine learning visions and other techniques are used as tools towards answering complicated neuroscience and behavioral questions. I wonder if you can just comment a bit if you see any particular technical challenge, say, where is there any points where you feel like some machine learning needs to be developed to answer your questions, or where the kind of question you do will somewhat point at new algorithms that are needed or can be inspired. So either you need them, or you say, oh, you should do it that way because this is what I don't know, biology, for example, would suggest. So I'm wondering vaguely about interfaces from more technical point of view, specifically in terms of not only AI, but specifically of learning.
I understand. So one big issue that we are envisioning is really understanding this mechanisms of adaptation, which is a very general term, I understand. But so even at the perceptual level, at a certain point, each individual is able to adapt to the perceptual and how the other person is perceiving. And although in psychophysics, this is modeled in Bayesian term in a very simplified manner, I think that there's not yet a nice and well-recognized method to achieve that. So this is a really big open question. So I don't know if it's an issue of the algorithm not existing yet, or if it's just that the existing ones have not been already properly applied to that. So that's already one element that a specific element where I would really need the help from experts to really understand how to achieve that. This is the specific. More in general, I think that one big component is this that needs understanding is memory and prediction, so the double part of this. So how to enable a cognitive system to be able to capture what matters of its own experience, to build without being overflown by all the sensory information of the time, all the experience. So knowing how to capture and how to be able to pick and reactivate in some sense the right ones in order to predict the future. That's another very, very big question. We are exploring different existing methods. So as you were saying, I've not spoken that much about that, but we're also exploring a bit of reinforcement learning for other projects. We're exploring different methods ahead, but I think that this is a big, big open question that maybe there aren't yet the right solutions. Maybe these need to be developed.
Okay, thanks.
There is a question on YouTube by Gorvi, which says, when it comes to reading the body language, There was an investigation on normal versus aggressive. Was there also investigation on other emotions that were estimated from the speed movement or more higher level understanding from the body language?
Okay, so there are different studies that investigate emotions. And they are associated. Emotion are, let's say, fast and very clear modification of the way we act, or they cause very clear and fast modification of the way we act. The gentle versus aggressive or rude ones are styles, which is slightly different in a sense that they are long-lasting modification. So if I'm angry with Gorvi and I fight with her, and at the moment I will be angry. But then if I'm really pissed off, I will have a long-lasting feeling about that. This will modify also the way I interact with Nicoletta, for instance, even if she has nothing to do with that. And this is the style. So apparently, and this is under research currently, the neural substrate corresponding to these two emotions and style are different. And so there is quite some research ongoing on the emotion, but in terms of styles, it is much more recent concept. And so for the moment, I know just of gentle and rude or aggressive versus a neutral, because I never spoke about a third one, but we have also a neutral, which is neither gentle nor aggressive.
Other questions?
I have a little curiosity, if I may, about the telling lies part that I very much enjoyed. So I'm assuming, I was thinking about Blade Runner. I'm assuming that basically there was an attempt in imitating the type of cues that a human will exploit to see if the person interacting with him or her is telling lies, right? And so the dilation of the pupils is, I don't know, I'm not sure we are able to do it explicitly, but I suppose that this is the type of thing we would use. I'm wondering if there is anything else, I mean, any other cue that can be exploited. I was hoping there is something that could be actually, how can I say, understood from videos like posture or something like that. It would be very interesting in giving it a try, I think. Also using it with my daughter, for instance.
That's super difficult. Yes, we are actually investigating that. So what we are actually measuring, especially we are sure about that, especially in the second game versus the first, we can't say it's really lie detection. What we are for sure measuring is the increase in cognitive load. And what we know is that from the literature that usually creating a lie builds on your cognitive load. And therefore, by detecting cognitive load, you can infer whether a person is lying. And that's what directed us to pupil dilation, because we know that pupil dilation is very well known as a way to detect this kind of increase in cognitive load. There is literature saying that there's a lot of information in prosody, for instance, and even in the kind of speech that you use when you're lying. We have not explored it, but it's interesting. On the other hand, by just watching people doing that, we realize that also the motion of the body is very revealing. We don't have the data yet. We're running now a study to try and see whether in the very same scenario in which the robot was guessing, also a human could guess. So in this case, we will let the participants even hear what the people say, so they will know more than what the robot was actually sensing. It was just the eye. But we want to understand whether they get, how good they get, and what strategy they use about that. So that is the next step. So I will be happy to share the results as soon as we have them.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so any other question?
I have a question. Hi.
Bye.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I wonder whether there has been some exploration in closing the loop between this perception of feelings or of attitude between the robot and the humans. Let's say that the human is acting not in a gentle way. Can the robot sense this and maybe adapt its behavior to mitigate or to try to look nicer or be nicer? I don't know.
Okay, no, that's actually where we headed to. So that's perfect. It's a nice framing of what. So what we are doing, and we did also in collaboration with the thesis with UNIZE, was try and see how it is possible, which features characterize the gentle versus the aggressive movement in video. So, or at least motion capture, so that potentially, ideally, it would be possible to capture from video. So, and so as to enable the robot to detect that. At the moment, it's not yet there. So the robot is not able yet to detect,
Okay,
and that's why we have not yet closed the loop.
Bello.
On the other end, what we did a bit, which is not about the style, but about affective emotion, the example of the study that I briefly touched by Anna on the architecture, that was a closed loop. So participants were caretakers of the iCub. So the iCub was a baby, really a baby in that case. It did the strange sounds, which were names of colors in Macedonian, because Anna is from Macedonia, and we wanted to give feedback, but not understandable feedback. And participants were just asked to show, the toys and to interact, to be the caretaker for a moment for the robot. And in that case, the robot was able to sense their facial expressions, so to detect whether they were, happy or open to interact with it, and their tactile, so whether they were touching and patting the robot or showing objects. And as a function of how interactive the robot felt the participant be, it adapted its own internal model, its internal comfort, so to say, to ask more or less interaction in the next time. So if you were a person that didn't like to interact that much, iCub made it less frequent, its own interaction request. Whereas if you are a very interactive person, then the robot asked more and more for your participation in the game. So that was a nice, and this allowed us also to study, this internal motivation mechanism that was, in this case, hormonal inspiration. So it is a collaboration with Lola Cagnamero, who studied how in us this emotions, let's say, these affective components can grow also and are based by emotion, and how this can be modeled in robots. And that worked pretty nicely because this degree of adaptation of the robot made the interaction more fluid.
Thank you. Thank you. This is quite interesting. Thank you.